morning! This is week 11 of the history of 19th century fashion, and I would like to talk with you about clothes for special occasions, so clothes that were not worn on day-to-day, but rather rarely and in specific circumstances. This subject could be subdivided into two smaller parts, and we are going to discuss them this week and the next. So one is rare and important events that happen just a few times in a person's life, such as weddings, funerals, and presentation at court. We'll discuss it next week. But today I'd like to talk about clothes for leisure. And of course, if we talk about the 19th century, as time went on, there were more and more occasions for leisure activities, very often involving special clothes. So Victorians, as you know already, liked to regularize every aspect of life. So especially in the second half of the 19th century, we have more specialized clothes for different social occasions, and they are a mark of appropriateness, they are a mark of status. And so what we have are clothes, for example, for different sports and holiday occasions, especially for the seaside. They follow the general principles of fashion, of styles, but they are of course adapted for the occasion. And especially as we are going to talk today about sports and holidays, the general rule was, in many cases, although not in all cases as you will see, to be providing more comfort and ease compared with ordinary clothes. I said it's not in all occasions, and the occasion that I would like to discuss first is probably the most popular, elegant sport for ladies that was popular throughout the 19th century, so did not really arise towards the end of the 19th century on the wave of the new woman activities and more popular leisures involving different sports. We'll talk about them slightly later, but the sport that epitomized elegance and high social status was, of course, horse riding. And horse riding remained popular throughout the 19th century, so we can really discuss the clothes involved in horse riding from the very beginning of the long 19th century to the very end. Of course, horse riding was part of the lifestyle of the country gentlemen and ladies, but in the country it didn't really involve a separate, very formalized costume. Women who enjoyed riding horses in the country, in their own estates, basically would wear more comfortable versions of day dresses. However, with the growing urbanization and many wealthy families going to the cities, at least for a part of the year, horse riding in parks became a very fashionable activity for men and women, and especially for women, this was one of the very few sports in which they could participate, in which even they could compete in a way somewhat with men, and which they could use to draw attention to their elegance, to their fashionable dress, to their good manners, good figure, and other, I would say, attractive qualities. So what we have is relatively early the development of a certain costume, a specific costume called a riding habit. A riding habit consisted of a matching skirt and jacket, and it was generally made by tailors rather than dressmakers. So this is one of those costumes that ladies' tailors would produce rather than regular dressmakers. The difference, of course, is in the fabric used. That is, of course, more quote-unquote masculine fabrics, mostly dark woolen cloth. If you remember the tailor-made costume from the last quarter of the 19th century, the riding habit became one of the most important inspirations that started this later variation of a day fashion. So, of course, the other inspiration were men's clothes, but the riding habit has always been I would say more masculine in a symbolic way than regular day clothes for women. The choice of colors, the choice of fabrics, the choice of accessories as well. Some elements, especially the hats, were modified versions of male hats, or the hats that resembled masculine hats from the period. Usually the most popular version of a riding hat was a top hat with a more feminine, softening addition of a flowing veil, or some ribbons or streamers, or something that would attractively wave as the woman was riding a horse. Some other versions of men's hats, or let's say modified men's hats, were also popular, especially in the second half of the century. So, for example, a bowler hat or a variation of a bowler hat could also be worn. But the general idea is that this was a costume consisting of a long skirt with a matching jacket. Sometimes in the early years of the 19th century, in the neoclassical period, it could be a long dress, looking more like an overcoat really, because it was made of wool. With some sort of hat and also some other accessories, especially if you look at the blouses that were worn with the riding habit. They resemble male shirts. They are very often worn with some sort of neck decoration, not usually a recognizable male neckcloth or necktie, although later a necktie could be used, but let's say a ribbon tied below the collar of the blouse. This is something that is also borrowed and modified from the male garderobe. What is typical is that these were the comfortable clothes, but at the same time they were worn over a corset whenever the corset was fashionable, and they would emphasize the figure of the lady. So in the country, normally ladies would ride horses in the most comfortable way, that is with their two legs on both sides of the horse. In the city, in the parks, they would normally use the side saddle. So a special kind of ladies' saddle in which both legs were on one side of the horse. So it was more about elegance and fashion than really health and I don't know, physical activity. So the appropriate garments, the appropriate costume was very important. Accessories, of course, some of the accessories were more or less evident because of the function of the clothes, such as the stirrup, so a kind of short stick to pat the horse, to communicate with the horse. This was very often used with the riding habits. But also, let's say, decorations that would include some motifs referring to horse riding, so perhaps the brooches in the shape of horses' heads, or horseshoes, or something connected with, let's say, hunting. Of course, hunting on horseback, or kind of chasing the prey on horseback, was part of the traditional activities of the aristocracy in the country. You wouldn't do it in parks, but you might have like little accessories, like, let's say, decorations, mostly in forms of brooches, that would allude to such aristocratic activities. The general shape of the riding habit would follow the fashionable shape of the time. So in the neoclassical period, you would have the elevated waistlines. You would have the shape of the sleeves and collars, generally following the fashionable shape. In the romantic fashion, you would have bigger sleeves and the hourglass figure. Of course, it goes separate ways with the arrival of the crinoline and the bustle, because nobody in their right mind would try to ride a horse wearing a crinoline or a bustle, so only the corset would remain from all the list of the dress improvers. So perhaps if we look at the riding fashions from the Victorian period, the difference is most prominent, because it's not only in the choice of the fabric or the choice of the colors. Of course, the riding habits would be generally darker for practical reasons, but also the shape. The riding habits would not have the crinolines, and later in the 70s and 80s they would follow the general shape of fashionable garments, let's say in the shape of the bodice, in the shape of the sleeves, the collars, and so on, but they would not really include the bustle. In the Belle Epoque, this continues, so the sleeves are again more pronounced, and the corset, of course, continues to be worn. One thing that is also quite characteristic for the riding habit is that it was generally longer than a regular dress. It was so long that ladies' feet would be covered by the skirt when she was riding side saddle. So normally these dresses would be too long for walking. So they would be almost exclusively worn when the lady was actually planning to ride a horse, because they would present themselves the best when the lady was seated on the horse. So when they were walking, normally they would gather up the skirts so that their feet would not get tangled in the very long skirt. This is something very, very typical. Another thing which is not really visible on the fashion plates, but we know from the descriptions, is that quite often beneath the skirt there were matching pants, like the pantaloons or the long drawers, but they were being made in the same fabric as the skirt itself. So they would resemble trousers, basically. They would be a kind of trousers worn for protection because, well, a lady might fall off the horse and the skirt might be pulled up during the fall, so to protect the lady's modesty and prevent her from, let's say, involuntary exposure of her legs. Such long pants in the matching fabric, so in the same fabric as the skirt, would be worn. So in case an accident happened and the lady fell off the horse, it wouldn't look as bad really as exposing the legs. They would be wearing the petticoats as well, but this additional layer of special pantaloons or special pantalettes was something quite characteristic for the horse riding costume. So if we look at the kind of historical overview of the riding habits, we have those changing shapes, and we also have the fashionable hats following the changes in the general styles. But usually they are more masculine in the shape than anything worn by women during the day. So if you saw a lady wearing, let's say, a dark costume and a top hat, sometimes with decorations like veils or ribbons or feathers even, you would associate it immediately with horse riding. Some women wore those costumes for other occasions as well, but this was kind of playing with the conventions. Here in the 20s, we have one plate showing two minor celebrities, let's call them, the ladies of, I won't really say the Welsh name properly, Llangollen or Llangollen, as the Welsh language probably would really mean. These were two noble women from Ireland who actually escaped from their families because the families were trying to force them to enter arranged marriages with some men they didn't like, and they lived together in a house in Wales, in this little village. They became art collectors, they became kind of local celebrities, socialites. Some say they were lesbians. We do not really know. They are definitely a kind of LGBT figures nowadays, but we will never know what their relationship really was like. It could have been just very close friendship, but here we have them dressed in riding habits, apparently walking. You can see they carry the excess amount of their skirts in their hands, and they definitely look more quote-unquote masculine than a typical woman from this period would. The choice of the fabrics, the choice of colors, the choice of accessories. This is perhaps why they were let's say, kind of controversial or dubious. They were not really scandalous in their lifetime, but this is all those associations, not only with the social status, but also with gender. What else? Queen Victoria, when she was young, she was a very passionate horsewoman, and we have some plates showing Queen Victoria on horseback shortly after her coronation. So she enjoyed horse riding very much. Of course, she had fashionable riding habits to go with that. And we have here two images of Queen Victoria on horseback wearing fashionable, smart riding habits with top hats decorated with veils. So if the circumstances were right, so if there was an actual horse involved, there was absolutely no discussion of the, let's say, propriety of this garment. Even though, as you can see in several plates, it looks very different from the regular day clothes. We have some early Victorian fashion plates actually emphasizing the difference between regular day clothes, which are worn with bonnets and which are made of light-colored, lighter fabrics, probably cotton mostly, and the riding habits, which follow the same shape, but their color, their fabric, and their accessories are different. They look more modern nowadays. They look like something, let's say, closer to our present sensibility than those very feminine, traditionally feminine Victorian clothes. So there were some, let's say, scandalous women like the French writer George Sand, who would wear the riding habit even with the trousers during the day. But these are women who were deliberately going against the mainstream fashion for shock value. The riding habit worn with a skirt was not shocking. It was, let's say, a sign of high status, of, let's say, the indication that the lady owned the horse, or at least, as you could do in some parks, like in Hyde Park in London, she could rent a horse for riding. And she could afford special clothes, and definitely the riding habit was one of the most expensive costumes that you could buy, and it definitely had to be made to measure because it was so tight-fitting. The bodice, the upper part, was so tight-fitting. So it was definitely a mark of wealth and high status, but it was not really shocking, let's say. So here we have some more fashion plates, usually playing the contrast between the day clothes and the regular day clothes and the riding habits. So especially if you have the couples and you have a woman wearing a typical mainstream day dress, a woman wearing a riding habit, and a gentleman. You can see that in many aspects the riding habit is closer to gentleman's fashion than a regular day dress. Especially the hats. The hats were really kind of fast, to use the Victorian phrase. In the 50s, of course, the regular day outfits would include crinolines. The riding habits do not, and as you can see, there is a fashion for other types of hats than the typical top hats that were deemed extremely masculine. So you have ladies wearing some sort of broad-brimmed hats with some feathers or veils or flower decoration, so they do not look as masculine as in the earlier periods. But this is a passing fad, really, because in the Basil period the top hats are back. They are worn, they are smaller than male top hats, and they are worn a little bit like the fashionable hats of this period. So they are a little bit tilted forward because the ladies, the fashionable ladies, would be wearing the chignon hairstyle. So of course it had to be fitted behind the top hat. But in the Basil period, the Basil, of course, is not worn, but the top hats are back. And here we have something interesting, that is a portrait of Queen Victoria as a widow, riding a horse in her summer residence of Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, accompanied by John Brown, her favourite servant, confidant, friend. Some even rumoured that they were lovers. And as you can see, Queen Victoria is wearing the headwear of a widow. We will talk about widow's weeds and the mourning clothes next week, but this could be done if you wanted to. So that's basically it, and we continue in a moment.